Picture this: a remote stretch of highway buried under a merciless blizzard. A small-town diner owner just minutes away from locking up for what might be the final time. And one split-second decision that would prove how powerful human kindness really is when it travels on four wheels. This is the story of what unfolded on Highway 281 in the heart of Nebraska, where Harold's Diner stood like a lone soldier against a winter storm that seemed determined to erase everything in its path. The weather-beaten neon sign flickered weakly through the driving snow, casting an eerie pink glow across a parking lot that had become a white wasteland. Inside, the familiar smells of industrial cleaner and day-old coffee hung heavy in the air. Worn-out booth seats sagged from years of use, while an old jukebox sat silent in the shadows. Behind the service counter, a dusty CB radio remained untouched and cold. Harold Mason, 58 years old, and built like someone who'd spent a lifetime working with his hands, methodically cleaned the same stretch of counter for what felt like the 100th time. There wasn't a customer in sight. His weathered face, darkened by decades of sun and hard work, showed the deep lines that come from too many worries and not enough laughter. The clock read 6:42 p.m. Almost time to call it a day. Underneath the cash register sat a piece of paper that might as well have been a death sentence. A foreclosure notice. The third one. 3 weeks until the auction. 3 weeks to find money he simply didn't have for the back payments that kept piling up. Harold had never been the type to ask for help, and lately, even hoping felt like a waste of energy. He rested his arms on the counter and gazed through the frost-covered windows, watching the snow whip horizontally across the empty road. This wasn't just bad weather. This was the kind of storm that swallowed people whole. Maybe tonight would be the night to give up, he thought. Turn off the lights, bolt the door, and wave the white flag. Nobody would be crazy enough to venture out in this nightmare. That's when he caught it. A siren's wail, barely audible through the howling wind. Faint at first, then stronger before cutting out completely. Through the wall of snow, Harold spotted 2 headlights swerving erratically down the deserted highway. Then, with a bone-jarring crash that shook the ground beneath his feet, the vehicle spun sideways and disappeared into the roadside ditch. "Dear God," Harold whispered, snatching his heavy coat from its hook and jamming his feet into his boots. He threw his shoulder against the door, fighting the screaming wind as he stepped into the frozen hell outside. Battling through snow that reached his waist, Harold made his way to the wreckage. An ambulance lay buried halfway, tilted at a dangerous angle. Its emergency lights pulsed pathetically, painting red and white patterns across the swirling white chaos. Harold wrenched open the driver's door. Inside, 2 paramedics were struggling. A young Hispanic woman who couldn't have been older than 30, and a stocky redhead whose face was twisted with cold and panic. Strapped between them on a stretcher lay an unconscious man, an oxygen mask covering most of his ashen face beneath a wool cap. The woman, Elena Ruiz, locked eyes with Harold, her desperation cutting through the storm's roar without needing explanation. "We're trapped," she yelled above the wind. "We were heading to Grand Island Regional when we lost visibility. This man's in critical condition." Harold didn't waste a second. His Navy training from years past kicked in. He knew life or death when he saw it. "You can't stay out here," he shouted back. "Get him inside right now." Together they wrestled the gurney from the ambulance, the wind attacking them like some wild animal. Harold positioned himself as a human shield, protecting Elena and her partner Brian Ali as they hauled the stretcher through the snow toward the diner's welcoming glow. Once inside, the warmth embraced them like salvation. Harold swept his arm across the largest booth, clearing it instantly, then helped the paramedics settle their patient while wrapping every available blanket around the man's trembling body. Elena and Brian moved with practiced urgency, checking vital signs, adjusting equipment, connecting portable monitors. Harold silently poured 3 steaming mugs of coffee and slid them across the counter. Their patient, Mr. Vernon Hall, according to Elena, moaned softly beneath the pile of blankets. Brian's frown deepened as he studied the monitor readings. "His numbers are dropping fast," he muttered. "If we can't get his body temperature up, we're going to lose him." Harold nodded grimly and cranked the ancient propane heater to maximum, then plugged in a battered electric space heater he kept for emergencies like this. The diner's thin walls shuddered under the assault, but Harold couldn't care less about the utility bills. This wasn't about money anymore. Hours crawled by. Outside, the storm refused to show mercy. The ambulance, barely visible through the ice-streaked windows, had become just another snowdrift in a field of white. The highway itself had vanished completely. Around midnight, Harold tried the CB radio. Nothing but static. The landline was dead too. Their world had shrunk to this battered little diner. 2 exhausted paramedics, 1 dying patient, and a man who refused to give up. He scraped together the last of his bread and government cheese to make grilled sandwiches, watching Elena and Brian eat in exhausted silence under the harsh fluorescent lights. "You're going to need help digging out come sunrise," Brian said hoarsely between bites. Harold just grunted. "We'll figure it out when the time comes." By 3 a.m., Elena had dozed off at the counter, her head pillowed on her crossed arms. Brian slumped. In a nearby booth, one eye still on the monitor, Mr. Hall's breathing remained shallow and labored, making Harold's stomach clench with worry. Harold sat alone at the counter, nursing cold coffee and staring into the storm. He could almost hear Clara's voice behind him, her hands on his shoulders, whispering, "Just one more night, honey. You never know who might need you most." He remembered all those times he'd driven through weather like this himself, desperately, hoping someone, somewhere, had left their lights on. Harold stood and walked over to the dusty CB radio. He flipped the power switch and grabbed the microphone. "This is Harold's Diner on 281 south of Grand Island. We've got a stranded ambulance and a man who needs transport. Anyone out there with 4-wheel drive, if you can hear this, we need your help." He released the button and waited. Nothing but empty static. Then a crackle, and a voice broke through. "This is Big Walt from Aurora. I hear you, Harold. We're on our way. Got several boys with me. Hang tight, brother." Harold exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He turned back to the sleeping figures in his diner and allowed himself a small, weary smile. "You're not alone, Mr. Hall," he whispered. "Not tonight." Outside, the storm continued its rampage, but inside the old diner burned bright and defiant, a stubborn beacon refusing to surrender to the darkness, and help was already rolling through the night. Harold didn't close his eyes that night. He remained at the counter, CB radio within reach, his tired gaze fixed on the snow-choked windows. Every few minutes he'd glance toward Mr. Hall, still breathing but weak and shallow. Brian shifted restlessly in his booth while Elena stayed. Curled in her jacket, worry lines creased into her forehead even in sleep. The diner had grown dim, the old heater groaning under the strain. Harold watched every tick of the propane gauge like it was counting down to doomsday. But he wasn't worried about running out of fuel anymore. If it came to that, he'd burn the furniture if necessary. You don't abandon people, not in weather like this. At 4:30, the radio sparked to life again. "Harold, this is Big Walt. We're maybe 15 minutes away. Got some crews from Hastings joining us. A few rigs from Aurora are bringing extra hands, too. Roads are brutal, but we're making progress." "Hold on." Harold pressed his eyes shut for a moment, then brought the mic to his lips. "Copy that, Walt. Doors wide open." When he looked up, Brian was awake, watching him. The big paramedic didn't speak, just gave him a knowing nod. They both understood what 15 minutes meant out here. It could stretch into an hour or more, depending on the wind, the drifts, and Nebraska winter's pure stubbornness. As the first pale hint of dawn tried to push through the snow, Harold forced his way out the heavy door and stepped outside. The diner was nearly buried now. He could barely make out the crooked neon letters above the entrance. The ambulance had become just another mound in the lot, an icy grave if they'd abandoned it. He stomped his boots and scanned the whiteout, his heart hammering against his ribs. Then, headlights. One set, then two, then a dozen, like determined, stars punching through the storm. Harold blinked, certain he must be seeing things, but the rumble of engines carried clear through the frozen air, and he realized they were actually coming. A convoy of vehicles, mostly beat-up SUVs and pickup trucks, some with makeshift plow blades welded to their fronts, others hauling tow cables and snow shovels strapped to their roofs. A small army summoned by one old man's radio call and whatever goodness was left in the world. The lead vehicle rolled into the lot, a lifted Chevy Suburban with Walt's Auto Repair painted on the side. A mountain of a man climbed out, wrapped in layers of flannel and denim, a huge grin cracking his weather-beaten face. "Heard you could use some cavalry," he bellowed over the wind. Harold trudged over, gripping his hand in a firm shake. "You're a sight for sore eyes." "Walt?" "Wouldn't miss it," Walt replied, thumbing toward the line of SUVs rumbling into the lot, engines growling like a herd of buffalo. "Figured we owed you after all those nights you kept the light burning for us." Within minutes, a dozen men and women swarmed the lot, hauling out shovels, spreading sand, rigging chains to the ambulance's frame. Elena and Brian pressed their faces to the window, watching the rescue unfold in amazement. Brian grabbed his gear ready to help, but Harold waved him back. "Stay with your patient. We've got this handled." The work was backbreaking. The snow was dense and icy, more like concrete than powder, and the wind fought them at every turn. Harold's hands went numb despite his thick gloves, and his lungs burned with each frozen breath. But nobody complained. They dug like their own lives depended on it, and maybe in some way they did. After nearly an hour of struggle, they finally freed the ambulance. The big Suburban strained against its chains, wheels spinning before finally dragging the rig back onto solid ground. A ragged cheer rose from the lot, fists pumping in the bitter air. Brian and Elena rushed outside, their patient bundled in blankets, portable monitors secured to the gurney. Walt opened the back of his Suburban. "No way you're making it to Grand Island in that thing," he said, nodding toward the damaged ambulance. "But we can get you there." Elena hesitated for just a second before nodding decisively. With quick efficiency, they transferred Mr. Hall into the SUV, securing him between two massive volunteers who flanked him like human heaters. Brian and Elena climbed in beside him. Walt turned to Harold, his breath forming white clouds. "You coming along?" Harold shook his head. "I've got a diner to watch over." Walt grinned. "Always the stubborn one. We'll catch you later." With a blast of exhaust and crunch of snow, the convoy pulled away, moving slowly and carefully, a thread of hope unwinding through the blizzard. Harold stood there long after the last SUV had vanished into the white. The world was so quiet he could hear his own pulse in his ears. His hands shook from cold and exhaustion, but somewhere deep inside, a flicker of warmth began to grow. He turned back to the diner, wrestling with the wind to get the door closed again. The place was a disaster. Mud and snow tracked everywhere, tables piled with dirty cups, the heater wheezing fitfully. But to Harold, it had never looked more beautiful. He moved slowly through the space, righting chairs, wiping down surfaces, bringing order back from chaos. He was stacking plates behind the counter when he heard it again. The rumble of engines, but not fading this time. Growing louder. He frowned, wiping his hands on a towel, and moved to the window. What he saw made him stare in disbelief. SUV after SUV, truck after truck, pulling back into the lot. Not just Walt and his crew, dozens more. Vehicles he'd never seen before, people he didn't recognize, but all wearing the same determined expressions. They parked haphazardly, filling the lot, lining the highway shoulder, and then they started climbing out. Families, workers, neighbors from towns Harold hadn't visited in years. Some carried coolers, others lugged boxes. A few hauled propane tanks and firewood. Someone had a brand new heater strapped to their Ford Explorer's roof. Harold opened the door and stepped onto the stoop. Words failed him completely. Walt approached first, a mischievous gleam in his eyes. "Told some folks what happened here last night," he said. "Figured they should know what kind of man Harold Mason really is." Didn't take much convincing. A petite woman in a worn-down coat stepped forward, extending a battered metal cash box. Her voice was quiet, but certain. "We collected donations for Repairs, supplies, whatever you need to keep this place running." Harold stared, unable to move as hand after hand reached toward him. Cash, checks, envelopes pressed into his fingers. It wasn't just the money, it was the faces. It was the warmth cutting through the bitter cold. It was the undeniable, stubborn truth of it all. They hadn't forgotten him. They hadn't forgotten what it meant when a man kept his lights on during a blizzard. Tears blurred his vision, but Harold didn't wipe them away. He stood there and let it happen, chest heaving, heart pounding as the sun finally broke over the horizon and illuminated the diner's battered sign like a promise. Harold's place wasn't just surviving, it was alive again, and the entire county had come to ensure it stayed that way. Harold couldn't remember how long he stood on that stoop, letting the icy wind whip his cheeks, the cash box heavy in his hands. He wasn't a man who cried easily, not after decades on. The road, not after burying Clara, not after losing everything they'd built together with their own hands. But today, all those years collapsed into one sharp breath of gratitude, and Harold let the tears fall without shame. Inside, the diner filled quickly. The worn booths and chipped tables were claimed by people who didn't seem to notice the cracked vinyl or scuffed linoleum. They brought laughter and the clatter of coffee cups, dragging in their own folding chairs and spreading trays of food across every surface. Chili, casseroles, pies, homemade cornbread, fresh loaves wrapped in clean dish towels. Some faces Harold recognized from the old days when the diner stayed busy enough to need 2 waitresses. Others were complete strangers, friends of friends, or maybe just people who heard the call and decided that answering it mattered. The place buzzed with life, and Harold moved among them in a daze, pouring coffee, clearing dishes, shaking hands, patting shoulders. Every time he tried to protest, to say they didn't need to do this, to insist he wasn't worth the trouble, someone would smile or squeeze his hand, and the words would die in his throat. Walt eventually pulled him aside, his broad frame blocking the drafty entrance. "This isn't charity, Harold," he said gruffly. "It's payback. It's what you're owed for every meal you served someone who couldn't pay. Every night you stayed open when the roads turned to ice, and nobody else had the courage to leave their light burning." Harold swallowed hard, searching for the right words, but Walt clapped his back so hard he nearly stumbled. "Just accept it, brother. Let people do right by you for once." By late morning, the storm had finally given up. The sky stretched wide and pale blue over a landscape carved into gentle hills by the wind. The parking lot resembled a fairground. Trucks and SUVs stretched along the highway shoulder, families unloading supplies, kids building snowmen on the drifts. Someone had started a fire pit in the lot, and the scent of wood smoke mingled with frying bacon and the sweet aroma of hot cider, ladled from a pickup truck bed. It wasn't just about Harold anymore. It was about all of them, a stubborn, weathered community that had decided this beaten-up diner in the middle of nowhere still represented something worth preserving. Late that afternoon, Harold finally sat down at his usual stool behind the counter for the first time in days without 1,000 tasks demanding his attention. Tara, the high school girl who'd worked tables for him during summer breaks, had appeared out of nowhere and taken command of the coffee station like she'd been born behind that counter. Elena and Brian returned, exhausted but beaming, to report that Mr. Hall was stable at Grand Island Regional and that the ER staff had been amazed to learn how he'd survived the night. "He wouldn't have made it," Brian said simply, setting down a heavy brown bag of supplies from the hospital, a donation from the nursing staff. "Not without you." Elena handed Harold a folded piece of paper, a simple hand-drawn thank you card covered in shaky signatures and quick notes of gratitude from hospital staff, from Hall's family, from people Harold would probably never meet. He traced the writing, with his finger, letting the emotions settle into him slowly, not needing to rush them anymore. The sun dipped low, painting the snowfields gold and purple. Inside the diner, the walls practically vibrated with life. Voices rising and falling, the clink of silverware, occasional bursts of laughter. Harold's heart ached in the best possible way, the way old bones ache before weather changes, warning You that something significant is about to shift. Big Walt tapped a spoon against his coffee cup, drawing the room to silence. He cleared his throat, obviously uncomfortable with public speaking, but he pushed forward anyway. "Harold Mason," he said, his voice carrying to the back of the diner. "You created something here, whether you planned it or not. You built a place where people knew they could turn when things got rough. You kept the beacon burning when it would have been easier to shut it off, and it made all the difference." He paused, scanning the faces packed into the small space. "We can't let this place disappear. Not now. Not ever." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. A woman with graying hair stood up near the window, her hand resting protectively on a skinny boy's shoulder in a faded Carhartt jacket. "My husband used to say that the road only feels endless when you don't have somewhere to land," she said quietly. "Mason's was that place. Still is." Another voice joined in. A young man Harold barely knew, face red from the cold, but eyes bright. "You didn't just feed us, Mr. Mason. You reminded us we had value." And then another and another. Harold listened, stunned, as one by one the people he had fed, sheltered, let use his phone, given second cups of coffee without charging, stood up and told him he had changed their lives in small ways he'd never even noticed. It was almost overwhelming. Harold bowed his head, gripping the counter's edge like it was the only solid thing in the room. He wasn't a hero. He had just done what needed doing. But somehow doing it had mattered. When he finally looked up, Walt was grinning like a fool and holding out a thick stack of papers. Harold squinted at them until he saw the logo at the top, First Midwest Bank. Mortgage documents marked "Paid in Full." Donations covered it, Walt said, and then some. "You're clear, Harold. This place is yours again, free and clear." For a long moment, the world tilted around Harold, not from exhaustion or cold, but from the staggering weight of what these people had accomplished. He reached out with trembling hands and took the papers, pressing them to his chest like a drowning man might clutch a life preserver. Cheers erupted around the room, chairs scraping back, coffee sloshing, kids whooping and stomping their boots. Someone had gotten the old jukebox working, how, Harold would never know, and a scratchy old song filled the air, something about coming home after a long, hard journey. Harold laughed, a great booming sound that startled the folks nearby, then leaned on the counter and just let the noise and warmth and gratitude soak into every cracked, tired inch of his being. Later that night, long after the crowd had thinned and dishes were stacked in precarious towers behind the counter, Harold sat alone at the booth nearest the window, watching stars blink to life over a landscape still sparkling from the storm. The old CB radio crackled softly beside him, and he keyed the mic one final time, just out of habit. "Breaker 19, he said, his voice low and steady. "Mason's Diner's got the porch light on. Coffee's hot. Doors open. Come on in if you need a place to land." He sat back, smiling to himself as the radio hummed with static, somewhere out there. He knew someone was listening, someone who needed to know that no matter how hard the road, no matter how dark the night, there was still a light burning in the middle of nowhere. And Harold Mason, stubborn, grateful, and very much alive, would keep it burning as long as he possibly could.